Welcome back. This is part 2 of the video lecture series on the Restoration colonies, or the Middle colonies, with Carolinas and Georgia thrown in. So I'm going to try and get through all of those during this period. We have Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware are relatively small in their early colonial history, and then of course the Carolinas and Georgia. So let's go. We left off in the last video lecture on William Penn and how he introduced some strong commercial advertising to recruit people to come to Pennsylvania. So as far as the Quakers were concerned, they set an important precedent. They bought land from Native Americans. They went amongst the Native Americans unarmed. But here's the deal. They were recruiting other people who were non-Quakers to come live in Pennsylvania, and they did not all follow the same principles as far as their relationship with Native Americans. The non-Quakers treated the Native Americans very poorly, and this, of course, undermined some of the decisions that would later occur in Pennsylvania's history. So let's move on. This is an example of William Penn's treaty with the Native Americans. Over on the right, you see a wampum belt. This is an example of a Native American weaving that is a sign of an obligation and a treaty. So a belt would be exchanged when an agreement was made. So we, in the European sense of our history, create these paper documents, we write plenty of words on them, and then both people sign. For Native Americans, they exchanged belts, and those belts were your word, your sacred word. And of course, if you broke that word, that would damage your reputation forever. It was a very, very important obligation. The government of Pennsylvania was established with a representative assembly. It was elected by landowners. It wasn't a tax-supported church. Remember, this is established by Quakers. Freedom of worship was guaranteed to all. There was one issue, and that was, since the British government was technically in charge, they forced the people in Pennsylvania to deny the right to vote to Catholics and Jews, which was somewhat consistent with every other colony, with the exception of Maryland and Rhode Island. They imposed the death penalty only for treason and murder, and this was very, very lenient compared to what was going on in England at the time with the amount of capital crimes they had. So the society was set up. It attracted many different groups. There was no provision for military defense. Of course, they're pacifists. There was no restriction on immigration, and something important here is that Pennsylvania became the first colony to ban slavery. So that was pretty profound and would have a large impact on the future. This is a comparison between the geography of Philadelphia and Boston, two very successful seaports. Philadelphia, of course, located up a river, Boston as a peninsula. All of the land over in this section, right over here in Boston, would eventually become filled, and that is all land today, but it was water back then. We'll also take a look here at urban growth. So both Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston of South Carolina experienced urban growth during this period. But notice Philadelphia. Philadelphia's population by the date of the Revolution in 1775 was the largest city in the country. It was over 30,000 inhabitants. So we come to New Jersey. New Jersey has relatively short colonial history. Okay, it was established in 1664. There were two proprietary deeds established in East New Jersey and later down in South New Jersey. And those two colonies by 1702, West New Jersey, they were combined into its own colony. There were some Quaker settlements, not a whole lot. And there you go. So we come to Delaware. Delaware, of course, is the smallest of the colonies, the smallest of the states, and let's talk about its small history. So it was named after Lord Deleware, who was the harsh military governor of Virginia. It was closely associated with Pennsylvania. In fact, it was a part of Pennsylvania, and the people of Delaware actually were represented in Pennsylvania's assembly, and it didn't even have its own assembly until 1703. And even though it had its own assembly, it was still technically controlled by Pennsylvania until the American Revolution. So that brings us to some ethnic groups. Now, if you take a look at this chart, you notice that Germans as well as Scotch-Irish immigrants had settled into this area. And one of the things that you should profoundly notice is where they're settling. I mean, look, they're going in. They're not living on the coast. Predominantly, they are moving into the wooded, settled areas. Now, these German immigrants and Scots-Irish immigrants were not English. The other thing to really point out about moving inland is that, one, you could have bought land, like you could have got a land grant, or you could have purchased land from a speculator. And it's kind of like a middleman, a person who like maps out the mountains and valleys and forests, and then sells land in a particular area. The other thing is, a lot of these immigrants coming into the colonies at this time, because in some areas this is beyond colonial authority. It's beyond the reach of the colonial militia. It's beyond the reach of taxation. And so some of these immigrants are simply squatting, which means that they're going to live on a piece of land that they haven't bought, but they will develop the land and move forward with it. So on to the Carolinas, and you have your visual clue. So we're going to move on and take a look at the development of these regions. And North Carolina and South Carolina, they're very important, but they play almost like an opposite sibling relationship with one another. So the South Carolina region, we'll see, will become very aristocratic. And by that, I mean that there will be a large division between those who have wealth and those who don't. And South Carolina earns the distinction by the Revolution and later during the Civil War of being the state in the colony that has a larger slave population than white population. North Carolina, very different. So North Carolina is settled. It's not aristocratically segregated at all. So you have most of the people there who scratch by a living and establish their own farms, but you do not see the economic division that you see in South Carolina. Okay, so how did they start? Well, there's a strong connection here to the West Indies. So some of the farmers English farmers from the West Indies arrived in Carolina in the 1670s. They brought black slaves with them. They wanted to establish a colony for themselves, and they did so. And in a few short years, the king granted this region of Carolina to 8 supporters. They were allowed to establish a proprietary colony, which means that they had the sanction of the English crown to sell land. But specifically, what they wanted to do here was they wanted to use the Carolinas as a base to supply their plantations in Barbados, both with food and wine and silk and olive oil. So they could deliver all of that to Europe. This is an interesting arrangement because what the founders of the Carolinas want to do is create a mercantile relationship between their colony in the Carolinas and the larger plantations in Barbados and the Caribbean, and hopefully for export to Europe. The profit motive being very important there. So the Carolinas establish the lower South, okay, and this becomes the territory that is predominantly settled until the development of the Revolution and the colonies becoming states. So you can see here North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And of course down in this area is New Spain. It's not even known technically as Florida yet. Something I do want you to notice though is that these forts, Fort William, Fort St. Andrew, Fort King George, these are all forts and trading posts that the English had established. And even though they were in some Spanish territory, they were trying to work their way up so that they could or I should say, work their way south, so that they could, encroach on the Florida territory. All right. So what happens here? The Carolinas are colonized. They're settled with strong ties to the West Indies, as I mentioned, including the slave trade. The local Savannah Indians are used to enslave other Indians, about 10,000 of them, and sent to the West Indies. And of course, the Savannah Indians, they decide by 1707 that they want out of this relationship. They move up to Pennsylvania, the colony there, by 1707, which is a haven for peaceful relations with Native Americans. The Carolinas, your book mentions this as well, decides to thin out the Savannah Native American population before they leave, and even though these were their former allies, the Carolinians decide to engage in bloody raids. They killed most of the remaining ones by 1710. Not a great example of a good partnership or alliance. So we see here the port of Charlestown, Charleston, South Carolina, of course. This is one of the largest and busiest trading ports in the South. As I mentioned before, there is a sharp division between those who owned great wealth and everybody else who worked for them. There was some religious toleration, and this was exceptions for the rule. They did attract, as a port city, many diverse inhabitants. Okay, the main crop of the Carolinas was rice. Rice was still a new and different food in England. It was very profitable. It was, of course, developed as an export because of plantations that were run by slaves. Okay, slaves had a genetic trait that made them somewhat immune to malaria in the area. Of course, that makes them susceptible to sickle cell anemia as well as some other factors. But by 1710, the black slaves were a majority of the population of South Carolina. That's pretty profound, and it has cultural as well as political impacts on the Carolinas as well. So they also exported indigo. Indigo was used as a dye. It was a very important one for clothing. You can see that rice and indigo exports make up a substantial amount of profits in millions of pounds exported per year between the years of 1698 and 1775. And of course, this stresses the importance of colonial exports. We see that there is some conflict with Spanish Florida. The Spanish had no love for the English on their border, and there were a few Spanish wars that were fought there. But by 1700, the military presence in that area established by the English was too strong to be pushed out. Okay, we do see North Carolina emerge as a separate colony. It shared a border with Virginia, and it had some distinct characteristics. Many poor farmers there, as well as religious dissenters. Many of them were hospitable to pirates. That became important with the islands that made up North Carolina's coastal area. And by 1712, it had officially separated itself from South Carolina. On to Georgia, okay, and your visual clue. So, Georgia, by 1733, was the last of the southern colonies, the last colony to be established. It was founded by 1733 by James Oglethorpe. It was named for King George II, who was king at the time. James Oglethorpe was an entrepreneur, but he was also a philanthropist. So there were two main reasons for establishing Georgia. One was to establish a military buffer between Spanish Florida and the Carolinas, and the other was to set up a colony to take British debtors and prisoners and allow them to settle there. Okay, here are the trustees of Georgia by 1734. This is also a woodcut of the port city of Savannah. And I'm going to wrap up just by saying that These are the middle colonies, and I look forward to seeing you in class tomorrow. Ciao.